The fallout continued this week from President-elect Donald Trump's phone call with Taiwan's president, the first such communication since 1979. The Obama administration said Monday that it had sought to reassure Beijing of Washington's commitment to the One China policy and warned that the call threatened to undermine progress made in U.S.-China relations. John Bolton is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and former ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador, welcome.
Glad to be with you.
So you wrote for us in January that the United States could play what you call the Taiwan card. Is that what is happening now?
Well, certainly this is a possible opening to do that. I mean, I think the call was the right thing to do. Taiwan is a democratic ally of the United States, and it was a signal of respect that we haven't shown in a long time. But I don't think it inevitably foreshadows a major shift in U.S.-China policy or Taiwan policy. It certainly could, and I think from that perspective, putting Beijing on notice was a good thing to do.
Well, elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the Taiwan card. What would that mean going forward? Because you certainly, I doubt that you're saying Taiwan should declare its independence.
Well, not now, that's for sure. But I think this is a neuralgic subject for Beijing.
Yes, it is.
Which makes it all the more important for the United States to have it on the table when we deal with China on issues that are neuralgic for us, like the effort in the South China Sea by Beijing to declare that a Chinese province.
Okay, so you're signaling, what Trump is signaling, saying, you're not going to help us on other things. We can show that we can get closer to Taiwan.
And it would be the right thing to do in many respects. I think the North Korean nuclear weapons program is another issue. China has not cooperated with us over the past 15 years, despite what people have said. And I think it's something that we should be emphasizing more there as well. So what I'm trying to do is broaden the array of subjects to raise with China.
Is there a risk, though, that you could encourage Taiwan to think, you know what, we could declare independence? Because I know from my experience with China, that is a red line where they would feel perhaps they needed to do something militarily.
Well, I think President Tsai Ing-wen is a very cautious person. I fear less that possibility, and I don't think we should be shy in saying to the Taiwanese privately, don't think about that. This is a bigger game, a longer game that we're playing here.
What do you make of the President-elect's announcement that Terry Branstad, the governor of Iowa, a personal friend of President Xi Jinping from going way back from the time when she spent time in Iowa as ambassador to Beijing?
Well, it's out of the normal order of things. Let's put it that way. Normally, you have a Secretary of State and then do the ambassadors. But this transition has followed its own pattern. I think ultimately policy is controlled from Washington, and I think ultimately it's controlled from the Oval Office. So who the envoy is, I think, is less important than what direction the president-elect actually takes when he gets in. And he certainly, this past week in his speeches, has signaled a continuing pretty hard line on China's economic practices.
Well, that's what I want to talk about, this broad possibility of a resetting of U.S.-China relations. Number one, do you think that's possible? And what form would it take if you were trying to advance U.S. interests?
Well, I think China is resetting U.S.-China relations with its assertive, near-belligerent territorial claims in the South China Sea, what it's tried to do in the East China Sea, its massive military and security buildup, including a blue water navy for the first time in 600 years. As to which the Obama administration's response has been pathetic and inadequate.
So you think China is essentially asserting itself to become a regionally dominant power and push the U.S. out?
Or perhaps go beyond that. Just a few months ago, Russia and China held their first ever joint naval maneuvers in the Mediterranean. The South China Sea, too, but the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think China understands that it has taken advantage of the Obama administration for 8 years, and I think it's time to signal that we have a new administration in, and it takes a very different view, and including on these economic issues.
But what does that mean in practical terms? Okay, I mean, the Obama administration would say, sure, we believe in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. We've sent U.S. vessels through there to show that we're not going to be stopped doing that. What would a reset look like? What do you mean? Is it taking on China economically and saying you don't have access to our markets unless you help us on a security point of view?
Well, I think it has to be a across the board. I really do, economically, politically, and militarily. And I think economically, the evidence of Chinese discrimination, not just against American investment and trade with China, but the European Union as well. The theft of intellectual property, disparate treatment in Chinese courts, more favorable capital allocation decisions. The chambers of commerce of the U.S. and the EU and Hong Kong and Beijing have been saying this for years. So I think taking them on to make China live up to its commitments in the WTO and elsewhere that they have not lived up to is a pretty big task in and of itself. And I think when we come to the South China Sea, honestly, the Obama administration's response has been pro forma. And I think China reads it that way. I think it's got to be very different. It would help to build up the Navy again to an adequate size, more longer term. But the political shift can be signaled very early. And that's what this the call to Taiwan's president may indicate.
All right. I want to ask you about the Trans-Pacific trade agreement, because Trump has announced that he's going to drop out of that on day one. Now, there are a lot of people in Asia that I talk to, our allies, who say that's a mistake because it signals U.S. disengagement from the Asia-Pacific on economic and soft power terms and cedes that field to China. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't know what the President-elect has in mind after TPP, but I think anybody who thinks it can be revived is mistaken. I think he's made that very clear.
I agree with that.
I think the mistake that was made, beginning in the Bush administration and certainly continuing under Obama, was to say that this is a strategic issue kind of masquerading as a trade agreement. And the result is very few people in the United States, at least, understood the strategic significance.
But is it a setback for us strategically by pulling out? Even if all that's right.
Yeah. Short term, perhaps it is. But I think now it requires us to think more coherently what we mean by a strategic initiative to box China out from asserting its hegemony. If you're going to do a trade agreement that encourages free trade between the United States and its potential partners in Asia, do that. If you want to have a strategic initiative, do something else. And I think it should be more in the security field.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador. Appreciate your being here. Still ahead, President Obama defending his counterterrorism strategy in a final national security speech. We'll look at his legacy and his advice for the Trump administration when we come back. During his last official visit to CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, Florida this week, President Obama defended his anti-terror legacy, telling troops at MacDill Air Force Base that real progress had been made during his 8 years in office, and offering what he called a sustainable strategy for future administrations.
Rather than offer false promises that we can eliminate terrorism by dropping more bombs, or deploying more and more troops, or fencing ourselves off from the rest of the world, we have to take a long view of the terrorist threat, and we have to pursue a smart strategy that can be sustained. We need the wisdom to see that upholding our values and adhering to the rule of law is not a weakness. In the long term, it is our greatest strength.
We're back with Dan Henninger, Mary Kissel, Bill McGurn, and Kim Strassel. So, Mary, smart, long-term. What do you make of that defense by the president?
Yeah, he is taking a long-term view and really accepting the terrorist threat and letting it grow on his watch. I mean, President Obama is leaving President-elect Trump with an extremely dangerous world, a far more dangerous world than he inherited from President Bush.
Okay, now, he would push back and say, well, I got bin Laden. Well, Al-Qaeda's been diminished. In not just in Afghanistan, but elsewhere. And nobody has attacked the homeland from afar. Now, granted, there have been some homegrown terrorist attacks, he would say. I'm giving what he would say, and your response.
Well, first of all, ISIS covers a far wider geographic territory than Al-Qaeda ever did. They're in North Africa, they're in East Africa, they're across the Middle East, they're in Pakistan, they're moving into parts of Asia. So
and that developed on his watch.
That developed on his watch, but you also have Putin emboldened, going into eastern Ukraine, threatening the Baltics. You have Xi Jinping making noises in the South China Sea, pushing his naval ships around Japan and making overflights. You have North Korea testing nuclear weapons. When I say this is a far more dangerous world, it is, not just in comparison to Bush, but I'd argue it's the most dangerous world we've seen since the end of World War II.
We'll give him credit for the drone strikes have taken out a lot of terrorist leaders.
Afghanistan,
Pakistan, and in the Middle East. They have done that. But when
he's taken some criticism from the left for that.
He has indeed, been killing from afar. But when he talks about the long view, he's right, because he has set up a world which is going to be in a sense of stalemate. Endless conflict, just standoffs in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, where both sides, it is not as though nothing's going on. This is tremendously huge battles taking place, like in Syria. And he did nothing to push it forward. It's just a stalemate, and he seems willing to settle for a world which is in endless conflict.
Yeah, if you listen to that speech, Bill, he really did elide over the Syrian Chernobyl, as David Petraeus once called it.
Right. Look, this is actually Obama making good on his promises. If you go back to his inaugural address, where he talks about leaving Iraq and leaving Afghanistan, this man has been sounding the retreat since he became president. In his speech announcing the 30,000 surge in Afghanistan, the very next sentence, he announced that when we would start to get out. So he's kind of frozen in time, too. He focused a lot of his speech. He's a lawyer. He parsed his word. Core Al-Qaeda, meaning just Al-Qaeda, right. The original areas. He also talked about, I think his word was, no foreign terrorist organization is successfully planned. Well, San Bernardino, now the threat is different.
They're inspired by
they're radicalized. So it's all in his terms. Look, if we want to get a read of his legacy, we should go around and ask people in Jerusalem, in Riyadh, even in Tehran. They would have a much more accurate picture of what he's bequeathing the world.
All right, Kim, how is Donald Trump going to be different in going after terrorism in particular than Barack Obama?
He has been somewhat vague on this. We know his broad promises, which is that he says he's going to hit ISIS very hard, destroy terrorists harder than anything has happened before, but while also doubling down on his promise to not commit troops to places and not have a bigger footprint.
Which may be a contradiction.
I think it is a contradiction, and we don't know yet. Now, look, he's picked some very aggressive people to serve at the Department of Defense and other places. We'll see what they come up with as a strategy for doing this. But at the moment, he hasn't said too much that would be a big change in what we're doing now.
And, Mary, one thing I think there will be a difference. He's not going to try to close Guantanamo.
No.
In fact, he may even send some enemy combatants to Gitmo if they're captured in theaters where they are not going to be normal prisoners of war.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. And, also, Obama's legacy is not just a legacy of American retreat. Obama went out and made deals with countries that don't share our interests or values, with Iran, with Cuba, for instance. And Donald Trump may take a very different view of those arrangements. Donald Trump also may not view American casualties in the same way that President Obama did. Recall that Obama told Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic that he saw the problems of the Middle East as a problem within Islam, and Americans are just sometimes collateral damage in that fight. I don't think Donald Trump will see it the same way.
One quick phrase. Obama's speech was a defense of the idea of leading from behind, and that's what he has done for 8 years. The question is, will Donald Trump lead from the front and reassert world leadership for the United States?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, Dan. I don't think that. I think he is in many ways, in the campaign, mimicked President Obama's rhetoric about not intervening abroad. And I think that resonated with a lot of Americans. And I'm not so sure, other than bombing from afar, he's going to do much different.
There were echoes in Obama's speech of exactly what Trump has said about not getting involved in nation building, not having troops overseas.
All right. Thank you all. Still ahead, Donald Trump's battle with big business continues as he warns another American company gets moving jobs to Mexico.
We love our companies, and we love it when they're employing thousands of people. But we don't love our companies when they leave and go to another country and think they can make their product and sell it back into our country like we're a bunch of fools, like they've been getting away with for the last 35 years. Not going to do it.
President-elect Donald Trump in Des Moines, Iowa, Thursday night with a warning for companies looking to shift production abroad following last week's deal to keep Carrier Corporation from sending almost 1,000 jobs to Mexico. Trump is setting his sights on other American businesses planning similar moves, including the Indiana-based manufacturing plant of Rexnord. So, Bill, what kind of message is the president-elect sending here to American business? And is it the right message?
Yeah, well, I think it's brilliant politics for a president-elect and very bad economics for a president. I mean, he's showing that he cares about workers, which is not usually associated with the Republican Party. But if he carries this through, individual deals aren't the way to go. The way to go is to make the United States, by lowering taxes, lightening regulation, a more attractive place for investment. And for workers, we have to remember that the best thing for workers is an economy where they can tell their boss, take this job and shove it, and go across the street and get another job. Right? That can't happen in an economy growing.
Now, you've said that to me in the past.
But in an economy growing, under 2%, that just can't happen. And workers have an interest in growth, probably more of an interest than anything else, because that's the only thing that gives them choice and opportunity, and they haven't had that for a long time.
So what does it tell you, though, Mary, when Mike Pence says, the vice president-elect says, that in fact, company by company is exactly the kind of policy that Donald Trump is going to pursue? We're going to do this case by case, day by day.
Well, Mike Pence was a governor, and governors love to do this. Even good, solid Republicans / conservatives like Rick Perry, for instance, when he came in to see us a couple of years ago, he talked about how great it was that he was giving away his state's taxpayer money to certain kinds of companies. Look, I think it's a terrible policy, and unfortunately, it also has echoes of President Obama, who liked to pick winners as well and liked to punish businesses that he didn't like. Except for Obama, those businesses were the coal companies or the big banks or the payday lenders, whereas for Trump the targets seem to be, companies that are outsourcing. I tell you what, if I were a CEO, I hope my name doesn't show up on Breitbart.com, because that seems to be the target list for Trump.
That's the website that Steve Bannon ran before he joined the Trump campaign. Dan, what about the Boeing episode? The president-elect said, look, seems to be $4 billion worth of cost overruns. Now we say for redesigning, creating a new Air Force One. He said cancel the contract. And I've looked, and I haven't seen any evidence so far of $4 billion worth of overruns, because I don't think the final contract's been struck.
Yeah, I suspect he may be pulling back from that one, because I haven't seen that there is any $4 billion contract yet at all. I mean, the danger here in going case by case is that one of Donald Trump's most famous phrases, he's going to drain the swamp. Right. This sort of thing fills the swamp. This fills the swamp with lobbyists. This is like what we used to call country club capitalism, where the guys on the golf course do deals with the governor and so forth. The better way, of course, is to get done with that tax reform bill that he wants, reform Dodd-Frank, reduce cost, so that this sort of thing isn't necessary, so that companies like Carrier don't have to think about leaving the country. And maybe we will get to that point.
But Kim, I want to take up, I can just hear some of our viewers saying, oh, you guys at the Wall Street Journal, you believe in ideology, you believe in Adam Smith, you believe in David Ricardo, get over it. That doesn't work anymore. Republicans, those ideas don't matter. It's the working man. Donald Trump won with that message, and that's what he's going to implement, so shut up and sit down and get used to it.
Look, I care about the working man, too. We should all care about the working man. And in fact, that is why this is bad policy in the long run. Look, why are companies moving to Mexico? It's not because they're anti-American or they hate U.S. workers. It's because they're not making it here, because our costs are too high. We're not competitive. So you can do a temporary Band-Aid and give a group like Carrier some subsidies from the state, etc. But if you're not focused as a president on the long-term goal of what Dan just said, tax reform, etc., these companies are still not going to make it, and those workers are going to lose their jobs ultimately in the end. This is not a fix browbeating companies to stay. The fix is in better policy and making America competitive.
Bill.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also I think one of the unintended consequences of this is you're going to have a lot more people saying they're going to Mexico if they think that there's a subsidy or better treatment on the other end. Look, we have this domestic...
Even if Trump is going to put a slap of 35%...
Yeah, well, they'll say it. They'll say it if they can carve out a better deal.
And it depends on what the marketplace for their product is. If it's overseas,
right.
If they sell most of their products in Europe or Asia, they may not care about the U.S. market.
Right, and it's not just overseas. This has been going on in the U.S. between governors, as Mary said. Governors are trying to prevent people not only from moving to Mexico, but the next state. Remember the Patriots owner? He got Connecticut to agree to a new stadium and all this stuff. And what he was doing was shaking down Massachusetts for $70 million in infrastructure. This is an old game, and they'll play it pretty well.
Political point. Carriers' workers win, but a lot of companies' workers are going to lose because they're not getting the same deal, and they could become angry about that and go into opposition.
All right, Dan, thank you. Still ahead, as Republicans grapple with what to do about Obamacare, we'll take a closer look at Donald Trump's pick for Health and Human Services and his plan to replace the controversial health care law. As Republicans in Congress grapple with just how and when to replace and repeal Obamacare, the incoming Trump administration is making its own plans, appointing Representative Tom Price as Secretary of Health and Human Services. Price, an orthopedic surgeon and six-term Georgia congressman, is a vocal critic of the Affordable Care Act and has been studying how to replace the law for more than 6 years. Tevi Troy is president of the American Health Policy Institute and a former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services. He's author of the book, Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office. Welcome, Tevi. Good to see you again.
Paul, thanks for having me.
So, do you agree with me, just stepping back a bit for the big picture, that this is a moment for Republicans to either, put up or shut up on health care policy? They've got to deliver now a replacement for Obamacare.
Look, Paul, I usually agree with you, and I agree with you in this case as well. This is the time. I mean, the Republicans said for years, we've got to get a chance to have a Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican President. We have those things. There is now an opportunity to get rid of the ACA and to replace it with something different, and so now's the time to see if those ideas work.
All right. With that in mind, Tom Price, pick a doctor himself. What do you make of his selection to lead HHS?
I think it's a great pick. I know Dr. Price. He's a smart guy. He's a thoughtful guy. He's also a determined guy. This is a guy who keeps introducing plans to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and has done it consistently ever since the ACA has been in effect. I also think it's smart to bring a legislator. A legislator knows how to work the legislative process. If you recall, Paul, the Democrats wanted to bring in Tom Daschle to be Obama's Secretary of HHS, and I thought it would have been a good move from their perspective. It did not work out, as you know, and the nomination blew up. And then we had a situation where they had to find a backup, and in doing so, they found someone who was not a legislator, and they were kind of behind the 8 ball the entire time. So, Secretary Sebelius just didn't understand the legislative process. Tom Price does.
All right, I want to talk about the legislation in Congress, but let's first talk about regulation, because it does seem to me that people say you can fix part of Obamacare through regulation right away, including maybe reducing some of the mandates. How much of the law can be repealed or minimized through regulation?
Through regulation alone, you're somewhat limited. I mean, the legislation was famously 2,700 pages. There are many, many more thousands of pages of regulations after that, but those implement the actual legislation. So you really need to get at the legislation. What they can do administratively are some kinds of waivers. There are both state waivers for Medicaid and state waivers in general for the ACA that give the governors a little more flexibility in how they cover people. But to really get rid of the ACA, you need to do it legislatively.
All right. Now, Republicans to talk on Capitol Hill, and I know you've heard it, is to say, first, we're going to repeal it, or much of it as we can, and then we'll set a date down the road, maybe later this year, or maybe even 2-3 years down the road, to replace it. What do you think of that strategy?
Well, President-elect Trump has said that he does not like that strategy on 60 Minutes, and he talked about doing the two things together. I don't know if that's possible. There is a window for getting rid of the ACA via reconciliation, which you can only do as part of the budget resolution, and so it's a time-limited thing, and you could do that without 60 votes. So that makes some sense to me to get it out there that this is what you're trying to do. But then once you do that, you own the thing. I've heard Democrats on Capitol Hill saying that health care is a form of inequity inedible sandwich that I won't say the name of on TV,
right.
And they want somebody else to have the sandwich. So, so Republicans have to be careful of that.
Yeah, Chuck Schumer has said flat out, the incoming Senate Democratic leader, that if Republicans change this one iota, they own it, and we're not going to help them one bit. And that's my concern about this repeal first and then replace strategy. That what happens is you make yourself hostage down the road to the irreconcilables. On the left, you'd have the Democrats who say, we're not going to help you one bit and don't change a thing. And then on the right, you might have people who say, oh, if this isn't a perfect replacement bill, I'm not going to vote for it. And then down the road, you have we're not going to vote for subsidies, for example, for anybody. You have some of those people on the right who will say that. Ted Cruz may throw a wrench in the works. So isn't that a risk that you might repeal it and then have nothing down the road to replace it with?
Absolutely, it is a huge risk, but another risk that they have to take into account is they've made such a big deal, as your first question suggested, about getting rid of the ACA and not taking care of the opportunity or not taking advantage of the opportunity would really, I think, hurt them politically as well.
So they've got to do something. Now, what about this issue of the subsidies? Okay, there are tax credits in the bill, as you know, that go to people below a certain income level. Do you think that those subsidies in some form have to be part of even a Republican fix so that people aren't thrown off their insurance?
So I think the key thing to remember is that Republicans are never going to outbid Democrats on the amount of subsidies and the number of subsidies they provide. What Republicans want to do is bring down the overall cost of health care, thereby incentivize people to purchase health care on their own. You don't want to have the kind of Obamacare essential health benefits things that skyrocket the costs of health care as we've seen over the last few years. So there should be some kind of, I call it a tax goodie of some sort to help some people, not everybody, help some people purchase health care. But you don't want to do what Obamacare did, which is raise the costs of health care and then provide a high-cost subsidy to some low-income individuals.
But you and I know that we were employed by a company. We have a tax subsidy for health insurance through our company. Okay, already. So if you work for a company and you get health insurance, you have that tax incentive. If you then lose your job and go into the individual marketplace, you don't have that subsidy. So I've heard a lot of Republicans talk over the years, we need to equalize the tax treatment between the individual and employers of big companies in particular. Should that be part of the reform?
Well, actually, this is one of the reasons I'm encouraged by the pick of Dr. Price, in that he's someone who believes strongly in the employment-based system. There's 177 million people get their health care through their employers, and I think it's really important to maintain that part of the system for the stability of the system. They're much more important numerically rather than, let's say, the 20-odd million people who get their health care via some form of the ACA. So I think it's important to maintain that system and not lose the stability of that system, and that's how I would proceed.
But if you're a Republican, you don't want the headline that people are losing their insurance in the private markets.
No, absolutely not. I mean, you need to use building blocks, right? So the biggest building block is the employment-based system. You also have Medicare, you have Medicaid. Those building blocks together cover the vast majority of people in this country. Then you want to figure out how to help the people in the gaps. And if you want to do it via the tax code or finding other ways for people to band together to buy health care, Dr. Price calls for association health plans.
Right.
I think those are smart ways of going about it.
All right. Thank you, Tevi Troy. Appreciate your being here. Still ahead, former Trump rival Ben Carson. No doubt an unconventional pick to head up the Department of Housing and Urban Development. A look at what the retired neurosurgeon could bring to the job when we come back. Donald Trump's choice of Ben Carson to head up the Department of Housing and Urban Development is raising eyebrows as Democrats and even some Republicans question just what the retired neurosurgeon brings to the task of overseeing a sprawling bureaucracy with a budget of more than $45 billion. The unconventional choice was officially announced Monday, with the president-elect saying he has talked at length with Carson about his urban renewal agenda and message of economic revival. We're back with Dan Henninger, Mary Kissel, Bill McGurn, and Kim Strassel. So, Kim, you've been doing some reporting on HUD for your sins. And, what have you found out? What do you think about the Ben Carson pick?
Look, I think this is a very inspired pick, and here's why. Because here's a fundamental problem with HUD. It is the welfare agency that Washington forgot. We've done all these other reforms, but HUD's just been allowed to grow on autopilot. These days, 80% of that $45 billion budget goes to federally owned and operated public housing and vouchers for public aid housing out there, which is for low-income Americans. Okay, there's no work requirements. There's no means testing. housing. We basically relegate these people to ghettos and projects with no means of getting out. So Ben Carson, given that much of his own presidential campaign was geared toward trying to get people out of a culture of dependency on government, I think he's going to have maybe a vision on how you do that at HUD.
Now, Mary, you covered HUD. You've covered HUD, and you know that it is it's a tough place to run, particularly if you're not steeped in the traps that you can fall into. What do you think of the Carson?
Well, look, I'll say one thing for Ben Carson. Carson seems to understand that HUD doesn't just provide public housing. It's trying to socially engineer the racial makeups of neighborhoods across America.
How is it doing that?
Well, HUD has something called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's very important, because what HUD did under Obama is it forced communities that take federal monies, which is basically every community in the country, and said, give us all this racial data, give us income data, and then we're going to tell you if you have enough Hispanics or blacks or other minorities living in white neighborhoods, for instance, and if you don't have the right mix, we're going to force you to build housing in those neighborhoods.
And its signature was Westchester, New York.
That's right.
Sort of thing. But he can presumably he can reverse that.
He could reverse that, but look, it's not just about public housing. HUD also has something called the Federal Housing Administration, which has become the new Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. FHA, as it's called, is an insurer. It insures mortgages, and it took over the subprime mortgage business after the housing crash. So there's a ton of risk there, and Carson coming in has to address that risk. He doesn't have the housing background for it. I have no doubt that he can learn about it, but that is a huge task, and it's an urgent task, aside from the public housing.
So you think the lack of experience could be problematic for Carson?
I do. I also think it's a huge sprawling bureaucracy. It's got, I think, more than 8,000 employees. It also has a web of public housing advocates, so-called fair housing advocates. It's got banks involved. You have a lot of lobby groups whose interests are involved in keeping HUD just the way it is, not just in public housing, but also for FHA.
But you think the big opportunity here, Kim, is the anti-poverty agenda, is basically trying to make housing, instead of a permanent, people putting them in public housing permanently, making sure that this is a stepping stone to to independence.
Yeah, this has been a new initiative of Congress. Speaker Paul Ryan, obviously his anti-poverty initiative, and you're beginning to see some good ideas coming out of Congress that Ben Carson could build on. Look, it is an issue. He needs to know that that bureaucracy and those interest groups are going to be out to get him. So it would also be wise of the Trump administration to put some people around Ben Carson that are housing experts and understand how you're going to deal with this pushback, too.
Good advice, Kim. All right, we have to take one more break. When we come back, hits and misses of the week. Time now for our hits and misses of the week. Kim, start us off.
So, Paul, the media absolutely embarrassed itself during this election with its support of Democrats. And whoops, they're doing it again. This is a miss to all of those publications now peddling the story that Barack Obama is handing Donald Trump a booming economy. Okay? I mean, part of this is the White House working with media allies to invent an Obama legacy that doesn't exist. Part of it is potentially setting up Mr. Trump. Look, we may be overdue for a recession already. This is a way to suggest that if it happens, it might be due to Trump policies. The country kicked out this administration because they know the real truth about the economy, and they're not going to buy it.
William.
Miss to the Fight for 15 movement, and this one was delivered by a former CEO of McDonald's. Back when the movement for this mandated $15 an hour minimum wage started, he warned it's going to cost jobs and it's going to cost the people at the bottom. McDonald's recently announced that it's going to replace workers with these self-service kiosks there, and that's exactly what he says. And look, the point is, a lot of workers at the bottom are struggling from technological changes that have been disruptive. It's foolish to make them more expensive to hire, and it just hurts the people at the bottom.
All right, Bill. Dan.
The media is full of concern that Trump is appointing too many generals. Trump's junta. Jim Mattis at defense. Mike Flynn at National Security Advisor, and John Kelly for Homeland Security. Paul, the last thing I'm worried about in this country is a military coup. Hit to Donald Trump for getting the best people he can find, and that includes the military.
All right, Mary.
I want to give a hit for American hero John Glenn, who passed away at the age of 95. He was many things. He was a husband, a father. He was a Marine fighter pilot who fought in World War II and Korea. He was a test pilot. He was the first American to orbit the Earth. He was a four-term senator and a true American hero. And now he's slipped the surly bonds of Earth one last time, and we wish him Godspeed.
Thank you all very much. And remember, if you have your own hit or miss, be sure to tweet it to us at JER on FNC. That's it for this week's show. Thanks to my panel. Thanks to all of you for watching. I'm Paul Gigot. Hope to see you right here next week.